All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, April 4th of 2022. A big week in the DFS and sports world overall. Obviously, baseball opening day coming up here on Thursday. Also, the same day that the Masters starts. We didn't have any Formula One or MMA going on last weekend, and both of those returned this weekend as well. So quite an exciting week for DFS, especially for SaberSim subscribers with all of these different sports we've been putting out models for recently here. But with that said, a little bit of like a semi DFS holiday today. No baseball yet, obviously. No NBA games today. I know we've got the national championship game, which will be a fun watch. And I know there is the single game slates out there and probably a hockey slate lurking around as well. But a bit of a quiet individual day here of DFS. So a nice calm before the storm that will be opening day of baseball and the Masters going on at the same time later this week. Anyway, let's go ahead and start getting into things here. First, I wanted to just mention up on our YouTube channel, made some adjustments, moved some things around here based on the time of the year that it is, including creating a new playlist and putting our two streams that we did last week up right at the top as a part of our new 2022 baseball content. So spoke with Matt on Thursday of last week for about an hour on stream, just talking about higher level baseball DFS strategy, and then had both Matt and Will on Friday for a little over a 90-minute stream here, doing a deep dive into our actual baseball simulations and models. So definitely recommend checking those two out before opening day. I will be putting out and adding one other video to this playlist, and it will be I guess basically a combination of kind of what I learned and what we talked about in those two videos, and a little bit of a product tutorial of how to use SaberSim to beat MLB DFS and how to build good baseball lineups. So the goal is that video will be, 15 or 20 minutes or so, and will be helpful whether this is your first season of baseball DFS or whether you've been playing for years as just kind of a refresher and get you up to speed with what's going on the baseball side of things. I know there's been a lot of questions for that. A lot of people saying, just recently either started playing DFS this year with NBA or just recently joined up with SaberSim during the NBA season and now transitioning to baseball. What do you need to know to be successful on the baseball side of things? So look for that video coming out before opening day here. I think it'll probably end up going live on Wednesday, but definitely recommend checking out these streams up on our channel if you missed it. We've got quite a few questions in our queue here for today. So we'll jump into these questions here in just a moment. I don't know. Spencer was here on the streams on Friday as well. I appreciate the thought, Spencer, here, but it is not my birthday. My birthday is in February. So maybe have me confused with somebody else. I saw that comment come through on the streams last week as well. So I appreciate that, but it is not my birthday. But anyway, let's go ahead and start getting into some questions here. A lot of different questions. We'll start with, looks like a few more baseball questions. I know there were a couple baseball questions I missed from the streams last week. A couple questions about NBA, especially late season as we start talking about playoffs and later season NBA. I see a couple questions about percentiles, especially for MMA here, some golf questions, some questions about the Sims overall, and then a couple questions just about overall process, especially on step 3. So we'll go ahead and get into everything. I wanted to start with a question that I had missed here last week, and this was from Andrew. And let's go ahead and get this one going. And he said, how do SaberSim's projections match up against other projections such as the bat, etc.? What does SaberSim do that's unique and separates it from other sources? So really good question here. And I wanted to start by saying, that at a very basic level, we do a lot of back testing of our average projections comparing to some of the other popular sources around the industry like the bat, Osmo, other sources like that. And we believe that our average projections are very competitive with what else is available. But that doesn't really give you the full story. What we are doing, because we are simulating games, is very unique compared to what else is out there in the industry and very useful for baseball. So when you see the app for the first time, just like for other sports, right, we have our projections as they show up here. And these are averages, right, just like what you would see. So this is opening day. These projections, by no means, these are up, by the way, but by no means are these final. I think there's even teams we don't have the full lineups in for anything yet. Obviously, very early in the week here, but we do have some very basic opening day projections up, and we have projections for batters and average projections and things like that. But what we are doing when we simulate these games is we're generating the full range of outcomes for these batters. And you can see, and this is true of pitchers, this is just true of the games in general, but you can see in baseball in particular, just based on the distributions alone, that there are issues with the average projection, right? It is not necessarily the most likely outcome, but the most likely outcomes are not even really centered around that. And also, they're not really the outcomes that you're looking for to build lineups with upside in DFS anyway. We want these outcomes, right, when we are building baseball DFS lineups, not these. And even for, an elite projected hitter, a good value play, for example, a lot of times these min salary, value plays will kind of pop a lot. Their most common outcomes, typically by a large margin, are 0 points or very, very few points. So average projections are somewhat important, right? They are a useful way of visualizing quickly what the average projection looks like for different players and comparing players, but they're not predictive of upside in any sense in baseball. And there's a limitation to trying to use them on their own to build lineups with upside. So by simulating out these baseball games play by play here, we can draw the full range of outcomes for each player on the slate. And then when we go into build lineups, right, very similar to what we do for other sports, we will pull from these different game outcomes, these different simulations, in accordance with what type of contest you are playing, right? So the sim variance slider will basically control how many simulations do I want to look at when I build this individual lineup? How big of the bucket of simulations do I want to use for each individual lineup? If your sim variance is at 10, we'll use a single game simulation for every single lineup in your pool. And as the sim variance comes down, we'll use more and more sims for each individual lineup. And we've adjusted this particular slider to where we think it is optimal based on the contest you tell us you're playing. So the default sliders, as they were, are back-tested and determined for a particular contest. And what you'll see by default for most baseball contests is that sim variance is going to be very high, typically 7, 8, 9, 10 most of the time for most baseball contests. And what that's saying is that average projections have very little value to us ultimately. It is more important to look at individual game outcomes or very small sets of individual game outcomes and optimize for that to be successful in baseball DFS. So looking at this question here again, how do SaberSim projections match up against other projections as the bat? Well, we believe that we are competitive on our average projections. If you were to use our projections for something like cash games, where essentially the average is all that matters, I believe that you would still actually have a very competitive cash game lineup. But that's almost beside the point ultimately in terms of what actually matters when you're playing GPPs and trying to take down tournaments, because what you really need is individual outcomes. You don't care so much about what this number is, right? And we don't really even, broadly speaking, care about what these outcomes are. We want to know what is the upside for a batter, how often they get there, how many points do they score when they get there, and what do those game outcomes look like too. So a very, very different approach than what else is out there, especially for a lot of baseball. A lot more on the baseball side, and frankly, a better implementation, we think. So. All right. Good question. Cool. I'm going to keep us going here. I'm going to knock out some of these questions that came in through Slack over the weekend, and then we'll move on to the questions that are in the YouTube chat here. So wanted to hit this one here. I think this is a really good one as well. This is from K Polo, and I know I had a couple users DMing me about this as well over the weekend, and I think this is a good time to talk about this. So this question says, do Sims factor in any data for teams that have nothing to play for and for teams that do have something to play for? And the answer is no. We do not. So it is, we have projections for tomorrow's slate already. So especially as we approach the end of the season and the playoffs, it is essentially a core assumption of our simulations. And I would actually even say just broadly projecting games in general, a very core assumption is that both teams are attempting to win the game. And that secondarily to that wanting to win the game is essentially a binary outcome that either a team wants to win or it doesn't. And you just assume that the team wants to win. You get a little bit into a weird area of determining how to project a team that doesn't really want to win, or if you put wanting to win on a spectrum, determining, what it looks like when a team just doesn't really care anymore versus a team that is almost actively tanking versus different situations like that. So as we approach the end of the NBA season, is a good thing to note when you're thinking about your projections, your exposures, things like that we are going to go in and basically assume that every team is playing to win the game that we are projecting them for. If you believe that there is a team that is playing more, that wants to win, that maybe must win that game to make the playoffs or the play-in game, I think there's a good reason to at least consider bumping the projection of that team. If you think that there is a team that is actively trying to lose, right? I know teams kind of, they obviously don't literally just go and throw the ball out of bounds, but coaches will manage their team a little bit differently to try to maybe get young players some run and maybe drop their overall record and try to get a higher draft position, right? I think this is a good time of year to think about things like that. And I think we can do it in a way that is kind of sharper, right? For example, let's see. So for tomorrow's game, right, the Nuggets, I think, are a decent example. I guess the Nuggets and the Spurs game is actually just pretty interesting overall. I don't believe the Spurs have clinched the play-in game yet. I think they're probably a little surprised that they're here, period, to begin with. But the Nuggets are definitely playing for playoff position. So at least in theory, this is a game that has some meaning to both of the teams here. And one way that I think you can be kind of smart about this is to kind of just see overall, where are the minutes projections going? Where are players, who's projected to get minutes as it stands at the moment? And, for somebody like Jokic projected for almost 35 minutes, I don't know. There's not necessarily a ton of flexibility there. I think you could argue that maybe there's a little bit more upside, that the Nuggets may push Jokic a little bit more higher on the minutes projection overall, but there's not a ton of room to move there, especially as we jump into the playoffs. I think one of the highest value things you can do is start to look to see where there is minutes flexibility. If we are projecting a player playing in an elimination game for 38 minutes already, there's less flexibility than there if that player is projected for 34 minutes, right? In a game 7 or a game 6 or an elimination game overall, you may see some of these stars get played 40 minutes, 42 minutes. And the difference between what we're projecting them on average and what their actual ceiling minutes outcome is starts to matter a little more. Similarly, I think it's very hard to say this team doesn't care anymore and have a very meaningful adjustment to the projections. But I do think you can think about that more in terms of your risk or your overall variance, right? I like many other people on Friday, I think it was, maybe it was Saturday, got burned by the very weird Pistons rotation that we saw. They started Cade Cunningham and Sadiq Bey and some of these other guys, and then they got one rotation. They all played 6 minutes and then didn't see the game again. That's a hard thing to just outright predict, but I think you can look at a team like the Pistons, and if you're getting a lot of exposure to those guys in your lineups, understand that they have nothing to play for. In fact, maybe they're incentivized to play less, to play worse, and maybe even incentivized to lose the game, and maybe scale back your exposure to those teams rather than making a direct minutes or a direct projection update. So overall, I think it is a very good point to make that at this point in the season, thinking about what teams may have to play for in one way or the other, whether they're playing for a playoff spot or playing to avoid elimination in the playoffs or playing to even get a better draft position, what that actually means. And I think that's a very good opportunity to start thinking about making adjustments. So, but it is not something that is taken into account in the model. And I guess I should maybe note too, because I think there's a valid follow-up question of something like, why is it not? Why is that not taken into account in the model? And I hinted at it before, but really the basic idea is that once you can no longer build a model that rests on the assumption that both teams are playing to win the game, it gets very challenging to figure out what to do there from a quantitative standpoint. Right? How much do you actually value a team not wanting to try as hard? what if that team has an opportunity to play spoiler, right? You have a team that's out of the playoffs that's tanking, but they have an opportunity to play spoiler, maybe for a team in the same division, right? Well, maybe they want to play a little bit harder in that game, right? Some coaches, some teams out there are just have a generally a more interest in winning games, even when their team is bad, right? As soon as you get to that point where you're saying that these teams don't care, or even put it another way, a team that's facing an elimination game, for professional athletes, how much extra gas is in the tank that a player can give more in a game where they're facing elimination compared to another just typical game where they're trying to win. I think that's always one of the most interesting discussion points around these narratives as we approach the playoffs. I think there's a strong argument to be made that from a rotation standpoint, a coach can play their best players more minutes, which would increase that player's projection. But assuming that you have a player that's going to play 36 minutes in an elimination game, 36 minutes in a regular season game that they still want to win, how much more can that player give in terms of a quantitative projection update that you could pick up on in a model? These questions are hard to answer. I think it's a little bit easier to intuitively make adjustments as just a person than it is to have a model in charge of that. So, kind of final answer here and in summary is that good opportunity at this point in the season, I think, to make some of those adjustments like that. And it's not something that's captured in the model. We assume that both teams want to win the game and equally want to win the game, and that there's no spectrum of wanting to win a game. So anyway, good question. Let's jump into the next question here. Okay, so a couple questions from In It to Bink It here. It's a good name, by the way. First one is, can you explain how the percentiles work in step 3? So let's build some lineups here for tomorrow's NBA slate. And we'll talk about the percentiles a little bit here. So I think first, while this is building, I'll define what the percentiles are. And maybe I actually should have shown this on step 1, but that's okay. The percentiles are essentially visualizations or a visualization of certain breakpoints in the range of outcomes for a player. So they're probabilistic outcomes. The 25th percentile is the fantasy point outcome that the player hits or exceeds in 75% of the simulations, right? They fail to reach that projection 25% of the time or less. The 50th percentile is the median. It's the middle outcome. 50% of the simulations, that player scores more than that fantasy point outcome, and 50% of the simulations, that player scores less than that percent of scores less than that fantasy point, and so on, right? The 95th percentile projection is that player's outcome that 95% of the outcomes are below that total. Only 5% of outcomes exceed that. The 95th percentile outcome, I think, can be kind of commonly thought of as essentially the ceiling of a player for that particular slate. So what happens when you go and change the percentiles here? What we are essentially doing is we will take, if you take the 95th percentile outcome, for example, is we will take that outcome and we will shift the player's mean projection to that 95th percentile outcome. We actually made a change here. Some of you that have been with SaberSim for longer probably remember this here. For a long time, you used to be able to change your percentile in step 1. And we removed that mostly because you get some strange results when you shift a player's range of outcomes to a percentile outcome in step 1, because it shifts the entire distribution for that player over, right? So if Giannis, for example, 86.5 is his 95th percentile outcome, we can see that outcome is probably right about here. What is literally happening when we do this here in step 3 is we are taking his mean outcome, which is probably closer to this, and we are shifting the mean to 86.5 fantasy points, which is his 95th percentile outcome. What this has the practical impact of doing on step 3 is we are taking a pool of 500 lineups and sorting the best 20 to the top after having moved every player's range of outcomes to that new mean, right? It essentially has the practical impact of saying, let's ignore the bottom range of outcomes completely. Let's assume that the player's ceiling outcome is actually their average. And now what are the best 20 lineups? You squeeze out a little bit more upside out of your pool at the expense of average performance, or particularly at the expense of caring about downside at all. And And that's essentially what we do. The important note here, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this doesn't really impact what lineups get made. This is just a sorting method that you can do in step 3. The issue previously on older versions of SaberSim is that you could cause some problems and get some very strange players in your pool if you sorted that percentile, or if you set that percentile in step 1, which is why we ended up removing that. So in step 3, changing the percentile is shifting the player's mean to that new 95th percentile outcome in this case, and resorting the pool of lineups that were made with all player projections at the average and giving you the best 20 that are now up in your pool. So that is how percentiles work. I think this is a good opportunity then to kind of make a quick jump over to a question that came into our support inbox over the weekend here. Let me grab this real quick. And the question was about MMA, and it something to the effect of, why do we advise users to not change the percentiles in step 3 when building MMA lineups? And it sounds like, if I remember correctly, there was a comment in one of our MMA streams that I did, or I think actually our most recent MMA stream that I did with Will. Don't have MMA Sims yet here for this week. Let's go back a couple weeks and get something pulled up here. And Will had mentioned that the percentiles on step 3 are best used as a research tool, as opposed to actually using them to set your final lineups. So let's build some lineups here and let's talk about this. I'll say this. I don't think you are going to, the risk of using percentiles for any sport, assuming you're setting the percentiles to 75th, 85th, 95th, 99th, even the 25th. I probably wouldn't recommend the 25th, but no matter what you do, your risk is probably pretty low, because you're still using the pool of lineups that was optimized for that particular slate at the average projection. It is purely a sorting method. So I don't want to give anybody the idea that they're going to mess something up because they set a percentile, right? It's not like you're going to ruin your lineups, or you're going to end up with a terrible set of lineups because you chose to use the 95th percentile outcome. I think the main reason why we typically talk, and why especially I often talk about the percentiles as not really being necessary, is because, especially for a sport like MMA, right? Let me make 2 adjustments here so we can see the lineups. Because we built these lineups at sim variance 10 to begin with, every single lineup that we have here is optimal for a single simulation of the entire card, right? There's literally a simulation that corresponds to this particular lineup, where this is the optimal lineup. And every lineup in the pool of 500 here, that is the case for every single lineup in the pool of 500. So the 20 lineups we're getting out of that are already optimal for a single card simulation. Shifting the percentile to the 95th percentile outcome maybe gives you a little bit more upside. I think what is most interesting about that is you can actually see what the actual outcomes are at the 95th percentile. Like, this is essentially the win condition of this lineup, is that when you get all of these fighters to have this particular outcome, which is why I think it's useful for research. But it is not as if you have to change the percentiles to 95th to get lineups that have upside, right? They already are lineups that have upside because they are optimals for a single card simulation. And that's generally true of pretty much all sports. It's not as if changing the percentiles is going to mess something up, right? It's perfectly fine to do that. Again, I do think you squeeze maybe a little bit more upside out at the expense of average performance. I think it can be very interesting just to look at. But because your lineups are optimized for a set of simulations that's appropriate for that sport and contest and slate, you don't need to change the percentiles. And in MMA in particular, in any of these sports where you're already optimizing for sim variance 10, since you're building optimal lineups for a given simulation, I think it is maybe a little bit extra redundant. I don't think it adds a ton of additional value. So Matt makes an interesting point here. He says, I think since most people use mean projections to build lineups, higher percentiles can make you more unique without sacrificing upside, and in fact increasing upside, especially in sports where the ranking between players differs significantly between mean and percentiles. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think my favorite personal use case for percentiles for me is in baseball. And I actually talked about this last year a little bit on stream. But you can actually see kind of an interesting let's see. Let me pull this up. So you can actually kind of see there's a spectrum of the difference between, I think this is exactly what Matt's saying, the difference between a player's projections at the average from a percentage standpoint is typically a lot greater than it is from the 95th percentile, for example. If you've got, let's look at a player, again, I know these projections are not, final or whatever here, but someone like, I guess even right at the start here, let's assume Tatis isn't injured, and this projection is actually what is going to happen, right? Goldschmidt is projected for 1037, Tatis 1219, right? He is projected for 1037 divided by 1219. He has, whoops. Hang on. Goldschmidt's average projection is 85% of Tatis's projection, right? On average, he is 85th of the projection. At the 95th percentile outcome, 26 divided by 30. Oh, well, that's not a very good example. I guess I will just say what I'm trying to mean, because that ended up being a bad mathematical example. The difference of average projection between hitters in baseball implies that there is a bigger difference in what their ceiling outcomes is when there really isn't. Most hitters in a similar salary band in baseball have generally a similar ceiling, and you will see significant ownership discrepancies based on the averages. So one of the reasons I like to use percentiles in step 3 for baseball, or at least consider it, is because it will make the difference between the best average projected and chalkiest hitters and the worse average projected and less chalky hitters closer together, giving you a little bit more of a diversified portfolio and less chalky lineups. So I have talked about that a lot for baseball before. That is a sport where I like to do it. So I guess kind of in summary here, because you are essentially just resorting your pool by using your percentiles in step 3, the risk is low that you're ever going to mess something up. It's essentially a different sorting method that optimizes and squeezes out, or doesn't even, I don't want to say optimize, that squeezes out a little bit more upside in your lineups by essentially diminishing the value of the lower portion of the player's distribution or as you're resorting the lineups. So cool. So those kind of a combined question there. So that was from In It to Binkit here and Liam in support about the percentiles here. So cool. And then there was a follow-up question as well. Do you update starting lineups for soccer? We don't at the moment. We don't have simulations or confirmed starting lineups for soccer. It is a sport that we plan on adding full support for in the future. I think we have kind of cautiously targeted summer this year for working on a soccer simulation. But at the moment, we do have soccer slates in the app. You can upload custom projections, build lineups. You will be essentially using SaberSim as a traditional optimizer if you're doing that, but we don't have confirmed starting lineups. You'll want to make sure that you have the right players projected in your custom projections if you're going to use us to build soccer lineups. So cool. And then an interesting question here, kind of a fun one from Reed. We'll answer this one kind of quickly here. He said, what's the best way to use the Sims for office pools where there are no salary restrictions? Choose 5 from the field, but can only use them 3 times per year. Basically just want the 5 best guys. And he's talking about golf here. So it sounds like, kind of playing something like a glorified one and done contest, right? Where you've got, so picking any 5 golfers, but you can only use each one 3 times a year. We don't have Masters projections up just yet. Let me back up to last week here. And see here. Cool. So I think this is kind of interesting. I don't think there's going to be. I don't think there's going to be a direct way that you can really use SaberSim to tell you what's optimal for this particular contest, because obviously we don't have a way to build that kind of lineup here. But I'll talk through kind of what I'm thinking overall here. I I think it is probably, depending on the overall size of this pool, I think it is probably best to play the golfers that have the highest raw percent chance of winning the event. I think even just using betting odds or salary is probably best to your benefit. And then to use some kind of, I don't know, intuitive sense of maybe where there's opportunities to fade a golfer based on injury or recent form, or maybe even like the potentially something like the course fit or course history, right? Any reason to maybe kind of, I guess, particularly spotlight a golfer who you may have a unique opportunity to use in this particular event. So if we look at the Valero from last week, right, just purely, I think even salary is a fine approach, just because salary is already adjusted for the betting odds of these guys, and it includes a lot of things like recent form and course fit and course history and things like that. I think just going down this list, I think it would have been a good opportunity to use Rory last week in an event like this. Hideki, obviously, right, some injury concerns. I think basically going down the top to bottom of this list and finding anybody that there's a good reason to maybe avoid for one reason or another. So I think Spieth was an interesting play in a competition like this. Bryson, injury concerns, I'd probably be a little more interested in fading. And then maybe you kind of follow that up with just Connors, Siwoo, and Maverick, right? I think the one other argument, I think there's a couple other things to think about here. I think you can also go ahead and look and see if there's any golfers that are particularly higher salary for that particular week, or maybe have a little bit, maybe it's a name that you don't commonly see week to week showing up at that particular salary range or raw odds to win. I think Gary Woodland was a good guy like that this week, right? His raw percent chance, even sorting by win percentage in our simulations, is actually pretty high. If we did sort by win percent in the simulations, and again, eliminated Bryson and Hideki, you'd actually have Woodland popping up in that list. But I think overall, in a pool that's probably just a random size, or not a random size. I read a comment that said random, like a smaller office pool size. I think it's probably to your benefit to just pick golfers that have a high overall chance of winning the event, eliminate any golfers that have a perceived downside or a significant downside for that event because of injury concerns or something like that, and go with it that way. The only other thing that I think kind of plays into this a little bit is if this is a sharp pool, if people are really tuned into golf, I think there's maybe an argument to be made for an ownership edge, right? For example, again, on the Valero last week, if you felt like Rory was going to be very highly owned, right? Not really in line. We said his top 5% chance in this event was 20%. His top 10 was about 30%. If your sense was that he was going to be 70, 80% owned in this event, I think it's an interesting argument to fade, right? There's quite an opportunity cost to that, because if you're essentially subbing Rory in with somebody like Chris Kirk or one of these guys down here, you're giving up a lot of opportunity. But Rory missed the cut, and his most common outcomes still were finishing, even outside the top 20, really. So, but that would probably only be the case, I would say, if the perception of this particular pool is that the field is a little bit, I don't even know if it's actually sharper. If you think that this pool is going to play kind of chalky, I do think there's an argument to be made to fade some of the golfers that are going to be the higher salary guys, the more outright chance to win. Anyway, that's kind of my first gut impressions of this. I would take all of that with a grain of salt. Mostly I'm just kind of kicking this from my head here, trying to kind of back into a strategy here with how I would go about doing this. But I'm sure this is something that if you wanted to spend an evening on it, could be optimized a little bit further. And again, I think there's probably quite a bit of value of just knowing the overall sense of how this pool kind of plays out and how chalky certain golfers are at the top, how efficient ownership is. They typically aren't for office pools and things like this, but that's probably where I'd start. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump back in to some other questions here. This one's from Eddie. And Eddie said, how do you decide on how many times to simulate each game? I'm interested if simulating a game 5,000 times, for example, provides us with better results than, say, 100, 500, or 1,000 times. It does. The more simulations we'll have for virtually any game or event is going to make us a little bit more accurate, as it just is it's a greater sample size from which to work with, right? It gives us that subset of the actual number of theoretical total outcomes a game could have is a bigger and bigger chunk. It's more representative of the whole. In reality, in determining how many simulations we run for a game, we will essentially take into account how many simulations we feel we need to run to capture a representative sample of the whole, but also looking at the time sensitivity of the sims. So NBA sims running in the final hour before lock, we will typically run smaller buckets of those simulations to get that sim done quicker, and also the kind of the technical requirements of the simulation. So, if there's there are certain sports where simulations are a little bit more technically intensive on our end to run, and in order to get those sims out in a time-sensitive manner, while still capturing as many outcomes as possible from the whole, right? There'll be a spectrum of game simulations there that are run as well. So, but good question. Cool. All right. Interesting question here from T. And I maybe we'll have some follow-up questions for you, T, here, because I think I'm a little confused, but we'll give this a shot. He said, how would I delete certain filled lineups from my pool? I know you can uncheck lineups to remove them, but I don't know how to do that for lineups from the pool. I like to filter my lineups. I like to filter my lineups and go lineup by lineup to pick the best ones. I only see how I can remove all of the filtered lineups. I only want to remove certain ones. When I click remove filtered lineups, it removes all of them from my lineups and pool. This would be much easier since I would only have to look at each lineup once and delete it if I don't want to. Thanks. Okay, so let's try this here. I think we'll be able to figure out something that works for you. I'm a little confused about the way that the question's written, but so let's go ahead and adjust this all back. Daniel, real quick, I'll see this just since I saw this. I'll get to your question shortly here. Typically, I answer questions in chronological order. So it's a Monday stream here. We have a lot of questions that came in our Slack channel over the weekend. So I'll tackle the Slack questions first. We'll roll through Slack, and then we'll get into the questions that have come in live on stream. So we'll hit, let's see, I have two other questions that came in ahead of time in our Slack channel before I'll jump over to YouTube chat, and we'll get there. So. Okay, so back to this question here from T. So what I assume it sounds like what you were trying to do is, okay, well, let's just talk about this. So let's say we filtered, we're looking at all lineups that have Mo Wagner, and for whatever reason, lineups that don't have Giannis, just as a hypothetical example. So this button, as you mentioned it here, remove filtered lineups, will remove all of the lineups that match the current filters from the bucket that you're looking at. So if it's just your lineups pool here, if we click this, it would remove the 6 lineups from your set that match this filter. If you did it on the pool, it would basically trash every single lineup in your entire pool that matches this particular set of filters. I think at the most basic level, if you want to remove a lineup here, you can just one by one uncheck these lineups here. That will send those lineups to, let's see, the trash, and they are basically gone. They will no longer appear in either your set of lineups or your pool. So hypothetically, you could fill back in with 2 new lineups, right? So I think that's the most basic way to do it, is just using the uncheck. I feel like I'm probably missing something about the way this question's written, but I think that's the kind of easiest approach, is to just uncheck your lineups. It sends them to the trash. It doesn't put them back into your pool, and you can just go from there. It may be to your interest as well. I've talked about this on stream a few times here. One thing you can do, if you are interested, is instead of eliminating lineups, you can set your lineups to like 1 and go into your pool. And sometimes I'll build lineups this way, is check individual lineups in, even whether you want to use the filters or not. I think this can be kind of a cool way, especially if you're playing, I would say probably 20 or less, but maybe even just like 5 lineups or so, going in and kind of picking your individual lineups out of your pool instead of messing with exposures or eliminating lineups. But yeah, I would say, I think the easiest thing to do here, as I'm understanding this question, would be to just use the filters, set the filters as you would like, and then use the individual checkboxes for each lineup that you want to remove. So, but, okay. So he said, sorry for the confusion. I meant removing individually from the pool. Okay, interesting. There's not, okay, so I don't think there's a super easy way to do that. I think what I would probably do is let's start over here. So I'm going to put everything back in. I think I would probably set this to 500. Start with all of the lineups you have, and then begin trashing the lineups you don't want. Because there's no way to like directly send a lineup to the trash if it's in your pool, but not unchecked. Right? So I think that would be the easiest way to start, is just put every lineup into your actual lineup set, use your filters, start removing lineups, right? We can now just kind of start tossing away lineups here. That's going to actually trash them. And when it comes time to actually set the final lineups that you want to play with, you could change this back down to, say, 20 or so. And the lineups that you trashed are gone. I think that's probably the easiest way to do that. But let me know if I'm still kind of misunderstanding here. But I think that's probably the easiest way here. So. All right. Okay, question from Mark here about League of Legends here. He said, please help me achieve easier step 3 stacking. Use an example from the, okay, so we'll do today's or yesterday's LCL slate. Oh, 2-game, LEC LCS. Okay. Let's see. Created 4 builds with 2 lineups using rules for each for a total. The goal is to build all 4 3 stacks, 2 with G2 and EG, 2 with G2 and TL, 2 with TL and G2, and 2 with TL and Misfits. Use different captains for all 4 stacks. Thanks. Okay, we'll give this a try here. I will say, in general, this is kind of more of a broad thing here, but I think if you are going to have this level of control of what you are actually looking for in your roster construction, it sometimes can be kind of. I think SaberSim is best used when you are willing to give up some of the individual super detailed control and allow the simulations to help carry you a little bit here. But I'll see if we can kind of work through this here together and get to where we want to go. But first off, if you only want 4 3 stacks, right? If you've decided that there's a certain stack construction that you want for every single lineup, I think the very easiest thing to do is to just enter that, right? And basically say, I want a 4 stack and a 3 stack from the same team in every single lineup. And as a starting point, that's basically gonna make sure the goal of what I'm trying to do here is make sure that we have the most functional pool possible in step 3, which means that we're gonna have the most flexible pool in step 3 to get the lineups exactly the way you want it. From there, I think it's probably worth building 1,500 lineups just to make sure you have as many as possible to get this done here. And I would also want to make sure that sim variance is very high. We want to have a very high variance pool because we have kind of a very specific goal of what we're trying to do with our lineups. So let's go ahead and do this here. We'll start there, and we'll see what we get here in step 3. I'm going to assume while this is building here, I'm going to show you how to do this in the most scalable way possible, or at least I'm going to try to show you how to do this in the most scalable way possible, which is going to be using the exposures. Assuming that you were actually just playing 8 lineups and you wanted them exactly this way, I think actually the easiest way to do this would be to just handpick them yourself. To go in and I'll show you this too, to go into the pool and actually individual cherry pick using like the filters like we were just talking about for T here, and cherry pick your individual lineups that you're adding in. But that's not super scalable if you're playing 80 lineups instead of 8. It's a little bit harder to get that done. So we'll start with kind of the more scalable method, I think, first here. And for those of you that are in YouTube chat here, I'll be jumping over to YouTube after we get this question done. And we'll go from there. The Monday streams are always busy here. I'm going to stop the build there so we don't just sit here and watch this build lineups. But I think if you were doing this in practice, it probably makes sense to build yourself a bigger pool. Okay, so now let's try to do this. So I think you want essentially... All right, let's go here. Okay, so we want 50%... Oh gosh. Okay, this is a little tricky. I actually am going to say this for the purposes of brevity here. I think if you have this level of specificness that you want to your lineup constructions, I would use the filters and handpick your lineups. So let's do this first. Let's go ahead and set this equal to 1, and then uncheck this here. Okay, and then we'll go to the pool, and I'm going to use the filters to basically cherry pick these lineups in. So we wanted 2 lineups with I'm assuming a G2 4 stack and a EG 3 stack. So what I would do is I would go in and check essentially the first 2 lineups. You could be more specific than that, but I'm just going to check the first 2 in. Then we can remove those filters. And we wanted 2 lineups with a G2 4 stack again, and this time a TL 3 stack. So we can go in and check those in. And then you do your TL 4 stack and your G2 3 stack. And then finally, what's the last one? A TL 4 stack with a Misfits 3 stack. Okay. And now we have a pool of 8 lineups that should precisely match what we were. Oh, I think I still have a stack. There we go. So we should have our 8 lineups that we kind of match up to exactly what we wanted to do here. First lineup here showing up as a team liquid captain. I don't know if you want a team position in your captain spot. You could be a little bit more selective in the way that you're actually picking the lineups out of your pool and putting them in here. But I think that would probably be the easiest way to do this. I would recommend, kind of going back to what I was saying before, approaching your lineup construction in a way that is a little bit more flexible than this. I think when you start to be very specific about that kind of construction, whether it's League of Legends or baseball, or you have not only an understanding of what the stack construction you want is, and not only an understanding of how much exposure you want to one stack, but also the individual combinations of how each stack is paired with one another in your pool. I think using a tool that kind of has a simulations-based approach like SaberSim does, you're almost kind of just forcing the builder to do what you want it to do. And with a traditional optimizer, you do have to have that kind of level of input. When you're optimizing just with average projections and optimizing for averages, that builder doesn't have an understanding of upside. And you have to program it with a bunch of rules and say, this is exactly what I want for this particular contest. I don't think you really need to do that to be successful here with SaberSim. What I would recommend doing instead, let's start here. And let's go. Here's what I would recommend doing instead. I'm going to delete this real quick, is you can still add value here. So maybe you know that you want to come at this with 4-3 stacks. You want 100% exposure to 4-3 stacks. I would start instead with a build, right? You can still keep those. Actually, you know what? Let's just delete the rules, right? Let's start with a test build here. And let's just see what we're getting out of this and seeing what kind of exposure we're getting to different players and different stacks and things like that. The other thing too is this approach to using the filters and cherry picking your individual lineups that are going to go in. I mentioned here before, isn't going to be very scalable. It's going to be very time intensive, and it may or may not add a ton of value here. I think the first thing we can do, we can build lineups and go see what stack types we're getting here. And very easily, let's set this actually back down to 8. I think this is useful, one, because it will help show you, maybe there are stack types that are optimal or, maybe a little less owned or more likely to be unique that aren't in the bucket that you were looking at. But let's just assume that you do still just want to play 4-3 stacks. Actually, you know what? We could very easily just go in here and say 100% 4-3 stacks, right? I think you can also then, once you've done that here, go in and look and see what the individual exposure you're getting to these teams are, right? Maybe you do decide, let's see, G2. So 75% exposure to G2 is what we wanted here, right? Let's see, in your original. Oh, okay. Well, you can go in here and set your individual exposures a little bit more in line with, what you want without having to go in and cherry pick individual lineups. All of this is to say, I would probably try to be a little bit more flexible with your approach, letting SaberSim have a little bit more control over what types of lineups that you're working with here, because I think it will give you about as much bang for your buck with a way shorter time investment to get your lineups where you want them to be. I was a little bit surprised actually to see that we didn't have we didn't have very many 4-3 stacks showing up here. So maybe you still start this with some stacking rules to set a 4-3 stack rule, and then edit your exposures to individual players or teams until you get the lineups the way you want them, instead of trying to build each individual stack combination. But assuming you want the stack combinations the way you want them, I think you can just go into the pool and cherry pick them out. So, all right, cool. All right, let's jump over to YouTube chat. I know you guys have been waiting patiently here. Let's hit this here. So Stanley says, what percentage of users would you say use optimizers or generators or specifically SaberSim? I don't even know. I don't have any basis for this, but I think it's less than people think. I would say, man, I would be surprised. Okay, so I'll qualify this, but I'll say this first. I'm talking in terms of unique players, not in terms of lineups. But in terms of unique players, I would not be surprised if 50% of unique players were building without the use of an optimizer. I think that is still continuing to shrink. I think there are more and more people using an optimizer in some capacity year over year. But I think people would be surprised at how few people that are actually in the DFS space use an optimizer, do any research, are aware of even sites out there that are intended for this. Obviously, at the lower stakes, there are going to be even more and more hand builders and people that are kind of doing limited research and actively trying to get better. With that said, though, those that have access to an optimizer that are putting in a little bit more time are going to build more lineups most of the time. So if you were doing it by what percentage of lineups were built using an optimizer, I think that number would be higher. So, but interesting question there. Interesting question. I'll leave it there. Scorpion said, with the game sims that you do you also collect lineup-based data? For example, which pitcher appears in the most amount of top 0.1% lineups? Okay, good question. Let's go ahead, because I saw another question that's similar to this. So, Kick to the Head had asked in Slack, hey, Jordan, can you quickly review again how you identify the odds/chances of a player or stack being in the optimal lineup? So kind of two similar questions here. I will first say that there isn't a way to just go read this value somewhere in the app at the moment. You can basically have SaberSim calculate this for you, but there's no number anywhere in the app in our data right now that says percent chance to show up in the optimal or anything like that. We've been talking recently, especially this past week here, about adding that in a future update. But for now, you can essentially calculate that, or at least approximate it, by using a build to do it, and using what I call a research build to do it. So, for example, for tomorrow's 12-game NBA slate, since we have limited selections here for tonight's slate, you can run a build that will essentially approximate this for you by running a build that looks something like this. So what you will do is you will run 0, 0, 10 sliders, and I think it's best practice to set the min salary to 0 and build 1,500 lineups. And what this is going to do, at sim variance 10, this is going to take a single game simulation for every game on the slate, count correlation and ownership 0, don't factor those in at all, and build the optimal lineup for that individual simulation of the slate, right? And we're going to do that 1,500 times. And at the end of that, we will have essentially 1,500 optimals for the way the slate could play out. And the exposure of each player in your pool roughly approximates that player's percent chance to show up in the optimal lineup for that particular slate. There are a variety of different issues with this approach. There's, on a larger slate, like a 12-game slate, the argument that 1,500 slate simulations is a representative sample of the whole, I think is not as good of an argument. There is also the question that, you don't necessarily need the perfect optimal to win NBA DFS on any given night. So approximating the player's percent chance to be in the winning lineup as the percent chance to be in the mathematical optimal maybe isn't as good of an approximation. But I think for Scorpion, what you are referring to here and what you are essentially asking for, this is the best way to do this at the moment. And for Kick to the Head, hopefully this was kind of a good refresher on what the research build is and does. Again, we are talking about adding basically these numbers or something similar to what these numbers are as an actual column or piece of data that could be used in the app, potentially in a future update, along with some other things here. But at the moment, you can basically just run the build yourself at those settings, 0, 0, 10. I recommend building 1,500 and setting min salary to 0 and going from there. So let's see. Cool. Okay, let's keep it going here. Brad said, genuinely curious. I found SaberSim through NBA stuff. Would you say SaberSim is better at one particular sport or pretty even across the board? I don't think, I wouldn't say we're necessarily better or best at any one sport. I think simulations and a simulation-based approach to beating DFS has individual unique benefits for different sports. I think, for NBA, for example, I think being able to quickly adjust to the way that a game changes when news breaks and having a late swap tool that allows you to take into account ranges of outcomes and ownership and correlation as quickly as you need to for NBA is a huge value add. I also think we're just very good at even projecting on the averages in NBA. In baseball, it's a very high variance, high correlation sport. Understanding the full range of outcomes for a particular player helps you better leverage against the chalk. And of course, having the correlation data from the simulations helps you build better stacks that are appropriately sized for the slate size and the contest you're playing without having to set stacking rules and figure out how you're going to change your stacking rules on a slate-to-slate basis. When we had talked about NASCAR a few weeks ago, right, one of the things that is very powerful about using simulations for NASCAR is that there is a lineup construction that kind of needs to be representative of an actual outcome of the way that the race can take place, right? If there are a race like yesterday, you've got two guys starting at the top, both going to be very well projected, but in the way that the actual race plays out, only one can come in first, only one person can lead each lap. Typically, it's going to be probably only one person's going to be able to dominate that race, and figuring out exactly how often those outcomes occur and what the individual lineup constructions that represent certain races are is very hard with average projections alone without using a bunch of player groups. So, I don't think there's like one sport in particular that I would identify as SaberSim's best. I think there's an advantage to using simulations in practically every sport that is out there. I do think it is a bit more, I think higher variance sports and high correlation sports, there's at least a easier advantage to argue, because the less normally distributed a player is, the stranger their range of outcomes when you open that player's distribution up, the less valuable average projections really are, the less predictive of upside average projections are. And the higher the correlations between players are, or between stacks of players are, the more value there is in precisely quantifying those correlations, like we can for football or for baseball or even hockey. So I think baseball is a very good sport for SaberSim. And that's not to say anything negative about basketball. I've crushed basketball all season. I'm sure most of you that have been with SaberSim for this year have as well. I think, again, partly because we are able to be so responsive to late swap news and can actually re-simulate a game and not just re-project players when news breaks. I think that's really valuable. But high correlation, high variance sport like baseball, it's a powerful tool. So. Cool. Alan said, happy birthday, Jordan. It is my birthday now, I guess. I see MLB contest popping up. What's a good contest to play for MLB under $3? Yeah, so it's interesting. Let's go ahead. I'm going to pull up the lobby real quick. In my video that will be coming out before opening day, I want to talk a little bit about contest selection. So stay tuned for that. But it's an interesting opening day slate we have here for baseball, because it's a day slate, and the Masters are on that day. And I think, all things considered, the contests feel a little small to me. So I don't know if this is necessarily going to be representative of what the contests look like over the course of the season. I would probably recommend, if you are, sticking to the under $3 kinds of contests, I would try to maximize the total number of lineups that you can get in play. And I think what I would probably end up, it's tricky. What I would probably end up recommending here is playing the quarter. I'd probably play the daily dollar here, and then I would probably, there's not a lot of high effective entrance contests in the MLB lobby for this opening day here. I think probably from there, I would play as many unique lineups as you can into the 50-cent minimax. I think the value of getting twice the number of lineups in play in the 50-cent outweighs the fact that the $1 has more effective entrance, but I'm not entirely sold on that yet. That's probably would be my approach at the low stakes. Frankly, I was a little disappointed when the baseball contest opened here. I think it's partly because baseball is competing with the Masters that day, at least in terms of DFS contest sizing, and also because it's a day slate. The day slates are always a little bit smaller, but for opening day, I expected to see these a little bit bigger. The one thing that always drives me crazy, and I don't know why it's like this, I really wish this $1.20 max was a bigger contest for baseball. I've never really understood why there is a 50-cent and a $1 150 max for baseball alone, and the $1.20 max is as small as it is. I wish this was a bigger contest, but say you had $20 or something like that, I'd probably play the quarter. I'd probably throw a lineup into the daily dollar, just to throw one in there, and then maybe play, whatever that is, 30 extra lineups in the 50-cent minimax. I think that'd probably be where I start. So overall, core principles for baseball are the same as they are for all of our contest selection, right? Focus on get as many unique lineups into play as possible. Focus on playing the lowest stakes possible before moving up in stakes. Play under $3 contests as long as you have access to them. That's all great. I think, you asked for under $3, so that's great. From there, the effective entrance thing is kind of tricky, right? Real quickly, for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar, we recommend people play DFS GPPs that have the highest number of effective entrants possible. The effective entrants is the total number of lineups in the contest divided by the entry limit for any one person to play in that contest. And the reason why we typically recommend people maximize that number is it rests on a couple core assumptions. The first is that, I guess actually the primary assumption is that there are players in the lobby that are long-term more skilled than you are. And the higher the number of, and those players are playing, they're maxing out contests and they're playing every contest. The more you can diminish the equity that player takes up in a contest, the percentage of lineups in the contest, the greater your overall ROI is going to be in those contests. The more dead money, the softer money is taking up the rest of the lineup positions. So strictly from an effective entrance standpoint, I would probably say the $1 mini max is going to play softer than the 50-cent mini max. But because you can get more lineups into play in the 50-cent mini max, especially if you're only playing like $20 to $75 essentially, I think it probably is worth playing this one before this one, but not entirely sure of how I stand on that just yet. I'm not entirely sure which contests I'm going to prioritize yet for this season, because I think there's an interesting decision to be made there. So cool. All right. There are a lot of questions here in YouTube chat, so we will just kind of slowly keep it rolling here. Let's go ahead and keep going here. So Daniel, we are finally at your question. I appreciate your patience. Said, I'm playing 3 lines in a 20 max NHL in a single entry. I'm new to NHL and struggling while using SaberSim. I've watched the NHL videos, but still not sure if I should set rules for stacking or trust the Sims. I would probably, I think for NHL, I think I would set some stacking rules personally. I really like the stacking rules that Mr. Clean mentioned in the most recent stream I did with him, and he said using basically a 3x3 stack of EVs. So at least 3 players from the same even strength line, and at least 3 players from the same even strength line. And this is basically going to build, what this will essentially do is it's going to build what I would say the most basic and also, to be honest, the most chalky lineup constructions that are used in NHL DFS, right? It's going to build you lineups that are 3-3s, 3-3-2s, and 4-3s, which are the most chalky lineup constructions, but they're also probably the safest and on average the best lineup constructions to use here. By doing so, you are theoretically going to lose a little bit of nuance. And on a 4-game slate, maybe you don't even really want to do this. Here, let me run some builds here. Let's see. I'm interested to see what kind of lineup constructions we get here without setting a single rule here. Give this a moment to build. Give me a moment to catch my breath here. I've been talking here a lot. I should probably have prefaced this by saying, because let me kind of start over here. Because we are simulating these games and we understand the correlations of these individual skaters and the correlations, we can even pull up one of these correlations here on step 3. You don't need to set a stacking rule. And that's actually probably true for virtually every single sport that we offer. You shouldn't ever feel like you need to set a stacking rule, right? Again, by simulating the games, we have correlations between players, and you'll typically see actually most correlations on skaters for hockey look something like this. There'll be very strong correlations between the skaters that share the same even strength line. Often these are some of the same skaters on the same power play line, and then much lower correlations to skaters that may just share a little bit of time on the ice, typically a goalie correlation to the skaters. But for the most part, you can just think about things as lines, right? Since we have an understanding of that because we're simulating the games, you will generally get stack sizes that are appropriate for the particular contest and slate that you are playing. So on a 4-game slate like tonight, for a generally pretty large field type tournament, You're not going to have perfect stacks like you may see recommended out there, like 3-3 stacks, because you need to get a little bit closer to that optimal to win, right? There's less players in the player pool. The winning lineups are going to be a little bit closer to the mathematical optimal. It may make sense to play some lineups like 2-2 stacks, 2-2-2s, etc., instead of just forcing in 3-3s. With that said, on bigger slates, I have found that I kind of like to build those 3-3 stacks because I think it sets a very good baseline of correlation of roster construction edge into your lineups and allows you to get a little bit more of your additional edge by leveraging against ownership or something like that. So I actually would say on a 4-game slate like tonight, I probably wouldn't set any kind of stacking rule just because the slate's a little bit smaller and we don't really need to force that correlation in. But for probably slates that are 6 games or more, I've liked doing this kind of stacking rule where I set at least 3 players from the same even strength line and 3 players from the same even strength line. And it will just make sure that your lineups are, you'll still take advantage of the simulations when you're building lineups, but it'll assume kind of a baseline level of correlation in your lineups by default. So let me know if that helps. I feel like the way Daniel said, in regards to my NHL question, I set 1 rule 4 from the same team and 3 from the same team and got some great lines. That works too. I think 4-3 stacks are probably going to be the most common roster construction types out there. So again, on a 4-game slate, that may not give you enough leverage against the field. You may have lineups that are even duplicated at that point, but on a big slate, 8, 9, 10-game slate or something like that, you can pretty much afford to just play a chalkier construction and vary your lineups based on the individual ownership of the players that are in the lineup or whatever from there. But yeah. Cool. All right. Jason said, how can you upload your own projections for NBA? Let's talk about that here. So first of all, uploading custom projections is on the advanced plan only. So if you're on the starter plan, you can't upload your own custom projections. But if you're on the advanced plan, you'll have this upload button that's visible here. And if you click this, this will pop up here. You can copy and paste data directly into this table. And that's the easiest way to do it. You can also upload a CSV here and just upload a custom CSV of your projections. But we have some logic in here as well that will kind of understand column headers if you have them. So let's say you upload projections that instead are like name, ownership, then projection, and your columns are named correctly. We can pick up on that and automatically adjust the columns accordingly. You can also kind of tell us what these individual columns are for, but that is the easiest way to do it. So JWH on the golf office pool said you probably should try to be seeking to maximize the odds above the field for each given realistically usable golfers over the course of the tour season. So, for example, while it may seem viable to use worse golfers in a worse tournament, if a high-ranked golfer is playing in a less competitive environment with great odds, you have high odds above the field. All that is to say, considering the competitiveness of the field for any given week is important. Yeah, I think there's probably quite a bit of optimization that can be done here. But I will leave that to the Office Hours channel in Slack for us to figure out what the optimal strategy is here a little bit closer, because I think it is a little bit. I think you can use our simulations and our raw percent chance to win or top 5 in the event, but not something that is directly useful for SaberSim. So, okay. Diego said, is there a way to go back to the default sliders SaberHeads preset once you've adjusted them? I noticed it stays at the adjusted levels. Thanks, Jordan. Happy birthday. Thanks, everybody, for the birthday wishes. Cool. So the slider, you can just change the sliders back to the defaults by just basically changing any of the drop downs and then going back to what you were trying to build for. So let's say you're building for a single entry 1,000 to 10,000, and you've gone in here and messed around, done this. As long as you change it back to something else, or change it to something else and then back to what you were trying to build for, you're good to go. So. Anthony said, does SaberSim have ownership for NBA single game? We do. We do. For every single game slate here, which is pretty cool. So these are generated basically by using an industry aggregate projection and building thousands of lineups at a very high variance setting. And then we will use the exposures to different players in that particular set of lineups as the ownership projections for that slate. So the big advantages of that in particular are that we can be very quick and accurate with projecting ownership for every NBA showdown out there, because it does not require any human oversight there. So Spencer says, what slider should I use for golf cash? Don't play golf cash. Please don't. It's not worth it. If you insisted, all cash games just build on the 0-0-0 sliders, right? You want to optimize for average projection, but golf, even GPPs in golf, I think is one of the lower edge sports out there. The salaries are very sharp. Ownership is generally going to be pretty efficient. Virtually no correlation unless there's a big weather event or something like that. So GPPs, I think, are hard enough on their own. On cash games, I think it's probably almost impossible to beat the rake long term. I'd be very interested to talk to anybody that had could demonstrate a profitable golf cash game process over a long enough sample time. So Spencer also says, does it factor weather? We do in golf, or not in golf. So especially as it relates to tee time correlation, the golf model does not take into account weather. So that's probably the most useful way to think about weather in golf. Is there an edge because some golfers in the field, based on their tee times, are going to be facing weather that others do not? And then I think you can justify, trying to fade certain tee times or trying to build groups of certain tee times to maximize an edge there. In baseball and football, two other sports that immediately come to mind where weather can have an impact on the way the game is projected, we do take that into account. So, see, Brad said, I know we spoke about the relievers in MLB showdowns. Does SaberSim typically import them into the showdown lines, or do we need to force them in? You will typically get a little bit of exposure to relievers, especially amongst your larger pool when you're building for baseball showdown. I would say if you're building like 20 lineups for a baseball showdown, you'll occasionally see a lineup with a reliever sneak in there. If you want more exposure, right? Maybe you want to play particularly unique lineups, or maybe play a little bit more of a ownership focused strategy. I think you can get a little bit more exposure to relievers. But yeah, they will be there by default. And if you build 500 lineups and view your entire pool for an MLB showdown contest, you'll typically see some decent reliever exposure. I wonder, let's see. I'm curious if we have any relief pitchers projected at the moment. We don't, it looks like. So, actually, it's probably because of this. Let's look. Okay, here we go. So again, these aren't by any means final, right? But most of the time, the range of outcomes for relievers looks something like this, where their most common outcome 60, 70, 80% of the time is to not get in the game, but they have like a very small kind of tail of upside outcomes that will definitely show up in certain game outcomes that can show up in your single game showdown lineups. So Chiquitio says, is there an edge in playing MLB cash? I probably wouldn't. I think I definitely it's easier for me to see that somebody could maintain a profitable baseball cash process compared to something like golf, but it's a smaller sport. So I think it's going to be sharper contests, a sharper lobby overall. There may be a little bit of an edge that you can push, especially early in the season when people are a little bit more excited about it. There's maybe a little bit of softer money in the contest, but the edge is so much smaller in cash games than it is for GPPs that I would probably just recommend, if you told me that you were playing baseball cash games, I would hope that you were playing all of the great GPPs that were available to you first, and that cash games were an opportunity to basically just get additional money down. But that's a pretty significant role at that point. And that's really the only situation I think it really makes any sense. It's basically like the main reason why I don't think there's an edge there is that it's too easy to find a decent set of projections and an optimizer designed to optimize for average projection to beat baseball cash at this point. If you are getting an additional edge, I mean, in baseball cash, you're either going to be basically trying to take advantage of all of the very soft money in the contest that people are either using terrible projections or not using an optimizer at all, or pushing a very thin edge optimized for maybe reducing your downside or something like that. Or maybe you've got a set of custom projections or edited projections that does give you a little bit of an edge over the field using other projections out there. But those edges are going to be very small. In a sport or in GPPs, for example, it is much harder for a traditional optimizer to deal with correlation and ownership in a way that takes into account the context of the slate and is well optimized for the contest that you are playing. The harder something is for a traditional optimizer to do it, the bigger the theoretical skill ceiling is in the sport. Is I think a very simple way of thinking about it, and that's kind of why I think there's such a massive edge in baseball GPPs. It's a high correlation. It's also a high variance sport where you need to be very careful with your exposure to the chalk. Using a tool like SaberSim that can take advantage of simulations of the game, build you lineups that are correlated and well leveraged against the field by default. There's a massive edge even over people using traditional optimizers, but much more so over somebody trying to like hand build a lineup, for example. So JWH said, follow up on that. Given SaberSim is using an aggregate of projection systems, is there an advantage of trying to get a sense of what the field of 50%? Whoa, hold on. Is there an advantage to trying to get a sense of what the field of 50% you project that is not using tools is going to do? I get your point there, right? Like if we're using an industry projection, I would say maybe. We talked last week. I think one of the biggest problems there is that the less rational somebody's going to be, the less predictable they are. So I get what you're saying here, right? Is that if we think 50% of people in a contest aren't even going to use an optimizer, then projecting ownership using an industry aggregate and essentially an optimizer is maybe not a good way of doing that. I think it's an interesting point. I think it's very hard to predict, like what is the worst player in the contest going to do with their roster construction? I don't even know where you would start with that. Like, you know that they're going to maybe play suboptimal plays, but in what direction? Are they going to be too chalky? Are they just going to play bad projected plays overall? Are they going to play a lineup with no win equity? I don't think that adds too much value. I think there's a very good argument to be made that taking the baseline ownership projections we have and applying your own research or a sense of kind of human intuition to them and making adjustments as you see fit is a really good way to optimize and make the ownership projections a little bit better. But I think going down this path of the way that you're thinking about it is really hard, because I don't know how I would go about doing that beyond maybe like name value. Maybe you could go in and say if there's particular names or teams that are maybe a little bit more likely to get clicked on by people that are just hand building lineups. I think maybe there's an argument there, but otherwise I think this makes sense from a logical standpoint. I'm following what you're saying here. I just don't have any idea how you would go about doing it. So, but I definitely would be willing to have my mind changed about that, because I think it's interesting. Also, my 50% of the field not using tools, that's kind of my gut call on that. I don't have any data to back that up. And the people that are using tools to build lineups are ultimately going to take up more of the equity in almost any contest you're playing, because hand building 150 lineups is virtually impossible. So how practical that number actually is, I don't know. Kick to the Head said, regarding SaberScore, is there a low-end SaberScore you would not use, as in your lineups range was 100 to 76 SaberScore? Would you use the 76 or try to run for a higher number? I would treat the pool of lineups you have in step 3 as all being entirely viable. I would use SaberScore as basically just a metric from which to use it, or basically a way to, I would basically treat it as a tiebreaker. Once you've added all of the other value, you want to go from there. So if you build your lineups and you want to make no changes to your exposure or anything on step 3, then I would say the best option is to just use the top 20 lineups, right? Sorted by SaberScore. But if you've gone in here and you've edited exposures, right? Maybe we've lowered some of our risk here. Maybe we've increased the exposure to certain players in our pool, right? Once you've left all of the other impacts that you want on your lineups in step 3, then I would allow SaberScore to determine what your final lineups are. And if you have a lineup in there with a SaberScore that's very low, I wouldn't worry about it. But I don't think there is a SaberScore under which a lineup is no longer viable. I would treat your pools that you are building, provided that you've built them for the with the right sliders for your contest, as building you a pool of lineups that are all viable. So, cool. All right, let's jump back. There are a couple other questions here that were in Slack, and then we'll think about starting to wrap up here. Okay, so this was from JWH as well. It said, it was noted that the golf sims account for course length, but not course difficulty. I was curious if you happen to have any insight into specifically how we might account for that on our end through manually adjusting projections. Yeah, so on a course that's going to play tougher, on a more difficult course, and let's see, do we have our master sims up yet? I don't think so yet. Eagerly awaiting that. We'll go back to this again here. Yeah, on a course that maybe people are talking about is going to play more difficultly, play more difficult, right? Or vice versa, play easier. On a course that's going to play more difficult, it's going to bring the theoretical projections of each golfer closer together. The raw percent chance of any one golfer to win, right, is all going to be a little bit closer. To me, what I think that the easiest thing to do there is to just spread out your risk a little bit more. You could, I think, accomplish that by bringing projections down for each golfer. I think it's far easier just to just think about that more in your overall strategy to that particular event. Maybe if you're normally comfortable with 50% or 60% exposure to a golfer, maybe you're capping that closer at 30 or 40% for that particular event. And vice versa, right? If a course is supposed to play easier, right? I think there's a bigger argument to be made that the spread of projections from the best golfers to the worst golfers is going to be larger. I would probably be more comfortable having more exposure to my top end golfers, my most exposed golfers, because their variance, their randomness is going to be lower, right? Easier courses are less variant. Harder courses have more variance. So I would, on a harder course, want lower overall exposures, probably a bigger player pool. And on easier courses, I'd be willing to have more exposure to the highest projected golfers. So I don't think it'd be something that I would do on the projection side. I think that's probably something that I would factor in a little bit more as you're editing your exposures, and maybe even curating a pool if that's the way you like to play. I know there's a lot of people out there that play. I typically leave every golfer in my pool as a starting point at least. But for those of you that do curate a golfer pool that you kind of work with for your lineups, I would, on a harder course, have a bigger pool. On an easier course, you can probably get by with a smaller one. So cool. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, so I'd answered that other question earlier here. We'll hit this one from Dawn. And I think this will be the last question for the stream here today, unless I see something else come in here. He said, does SaberSim perform better on larger slates, generally speaking? I think I don't have any data to back this up. But I would say that my gut is telling me that there's actually, I think, a bigger advantage to smaller slates, at least a tiny bit, than larger slates. On the one hand, on a 12-game slate like tomorrow, for example, there are so many players in a pool. There's so much to keep track of that purely using a tool like this is going to allow you to kind of track things much easier, compare all these different players, different projections, different game situations a lot easier, and being able to optimize 150 profitable lineups quickly and re-optimize those and late swap throughout the night is a huge value add. But on a slate like this, you will see that, for something like maybe the 4-point player, the and one, your default sim variance is going to be 5, right? And this slider can often be thought of as how much are we weighting individual simulations. Actually, you don't even have to think of it's not even can be thought of it. It is literally how much are we weighting individual game simulations compared to average projections. And a sim variance of 5 is still a moderate sim variance. You're still generally taking advantage of sims, right? But on a small slate, right, like the 2-game night slate tomorrow, the default sliders are 9 for the same size contest. And on contests, I think is a very basic rule of thumb on contests or slates or sports where the sim variance slider is higher by default. I think there's a more obvious and immediate edge to using simulations, because this is basically saying it is to your benefit. It is the optimal strategy to essentially optimize for a very small set of simulations each time you build a lineup. So somebody trying to do that with average projections and a traditional optimizer is going to struggle and have a hard time doing that effectively. Whereas you can basically do it very easily with just a push of a button, basically, on SaberSim. Again, it's not to say that I think big NBA slates are hard to beat with or anything like that. I mean, they are in their own right. I don't think there's no edge, for example, in using simulations here. But I think when in a sport or slate size or contest type or whatever, where the sim variance slider is higher by default, I think it does kind of imply that simulations are giving you a bigger advantage there compared to another slate. So JWH says Golf Edge. Do you think it's a little more viable in a week like this week with a lot of people playing because it's the Masters? Absolutely. Yeah, there is for all 4 majors, and even the players too. The players, there's a milli maker for the players, and I think the DFS sites and people kind of treat it like and these birthday comments are killing me. I think people treat the players like a major too. So yeah, for all the major weeks, there's a lot of soft money. So again, I think it's worth mentioning, because we have this conversation around the start of NFL season every year, because I think it's just a good point to make, right? Something like this contest, right? The $1.20 max. This is definitely a contest I'd recommend playing. It has almost 5,000 effective entrants in it, right? This contest for a typical week of golf is at least half the size, right? And probably, I think, maybe even a third of the size. Those players have to come from somewhere. And if they were profitable golf DFS players, they wouldn't just be taking every other week off or every week in between majors off, right? When you see sports or weeks or whatever like this, where there's suddenly a huge influx of players, it typically means that that sport is getting, the influx is coming from soft players and soft money. Right. Similar when inevitably football starts up in September, and you looking at the week before, baseball, I guess, is kind of the main sport going on at that time. And the baseball contests have, there's a mini max with 300 or 35,000 entrants or something like that. Right. And then the next week football starts and the mini max has 350,000. lineups in it, right? If that was an influx of very sharp money, those people would have figured out how to play other sports, right? Like there's not a ton of very sharp NFL money that is waiting around on the sidelines every year just to only play NFL. Most of the time when there's these big discrepancies here in where the money's coming from and the size of the contest, it typically means that influx is coming from soft money. So yes, I do think, I guess I should wrap around here to kind of the point I was trying to make. This contest, this short game, again, for example, that is bigger this week than it was last week, probably your raw chance of winning, your raw probability of winning this contest is lower, right? Because you're still beating more lineups, but it is not proportionally lower in proportion with how big the contest got, right? If this contest is 3 times bigger this week, it is not 3 times harder to beat, right? Then that is essentially the edge you've gained by playing against this softer field. This contest might be 1.5 times harder to beat, but it's 3 times bigger. Your expected value for a given lineup is higher when that soft money flows in. So yeah, I would say probably a great week to play some golf DFS overall. And I think there are times when I think that golf is a lower edge sport overall. I think it's definitely beatable for the major weeks. But Aaron said, any baseball bankroll videos coming? Before opening day, I will be putting out a video that is kind of a how to beat baseball DFS strategy guide that will cover some bankroll management and contest selection principles in it. Probably won't be a totally separate video like I did for NBA, but will be coming out for baseball. So, all right. Cool. We'll go ahead and leave it there for today's stream. That was a good one. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated. Big thank you to everybody that watches and listens to this stream as a recording on YouTube as well. We will be right back again here tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern for the 12-game NBA slate that's coming back here tomorrow. Look forward to my How to Beat Baseball DFS video dropping before opening day. And enjoy the national championship game tonight, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. See ya.